Some disappearances are marked by urgency and noise. Others pass quietly, unnoticed beyond the walls where they occur. In this situation, no alert was issued, no search was launched, and no public concern emerged when a child stopped appearing in daily life. The absence did not begin with a romantic moment. It unfolded slowly, in a way that allowed time to move forward without interruption. When systems rely on regular contact to function, the removal of that contact can leave no trace. A child can fade from view without being formally missing. That is what makes this situation difficult to understand. The delay was not caused by confusion or delay in response. It was caused by the lack of a trigger. Nothing was reported, so nothing began. Before we continue, subscribe if you value long-form investigations that focus on facts, process, and accountability without exaggeration. Erica Parsons lived in Rowan County, North Carolina, with her adoptive parents, Sandy and Casey Parsons. She had been adopted years earlier and lived in a household that appeared ordinary from the outside. There were no open complaints, no ongoing involvement from Child Protective Services, and no documented concerns raised by institutions during the period when she was still visible. At some point, Erica was removed from public school and described as being homeschooled. This change eliminated routine oversight from educators and administrators. School attendance often provides one of the most consistent checks on a child's well-being. Without it, confirmation of safety becomes dependent on caregivers alone. Over time, Erica was no longer seen by people outside the home. She did not appear in school records, medical appointments, or community activities. This shift did not immediately attract attention because there was no single event that required explanation. Absence can blend into normal variation when no reporting requirement exists. The last confirmed sighting of Erica occurred in 2011. At that time, no missing person report was filed. No welfare check was requested. From the perspective of law enforcement and child welfare agencies, there was no indication that intervention was needed. Neighbors later stated that they had not seen Erica for a long time. That lack of visibility alone did not prompt action. Families relocate, routines change, and assumptions are often made without verification. In this instance, those assumptions went unchallenged. What defined this period was isolation. Erica's life became confined to a private space without regular external confirmation of her presence. When education, healthcare, and public interaction are removed, the systems designed to detect harm lose access. There was no investigation because there was no report. There was no timeline to review because no disappearance had been acknowledged. Institutions that rely on notification could not respond to something they did not know existed. This absence of awareness explains why time passed without interruption. Erica Parsons was not officially missing. She was simply no longer visible to the world outside her home. That condition allowed silence to continue, and that silence shaped everything that followed. After Erica Parsons was last seen in 2011, life outside the household continued without interruption. There were no official records marking a disappearance, no alerts sent to authorities, and no public concern raised during the months that followed. From the perspective of institutions designed to protect children, nothing had been reported that required action. Without a report, there was no case to investigate. One of the key reasons Erica's absence went unnoticed was her removal from public school. Schools often act as the primary point of contact between families and child welfare systems. Attendance records, daily observation, and mandated reporting requirements create a structure where prolonged absence becomes visible. Once Erica was no longer enrolled, that layer of oversight no longer applied. Homeschooling laws in North Carolina did not require frequent in-person checks. Oversight relied largely on parental compliance and documentation. This framework assumes good faith reporting. When that assumption fails, gaps can emerge without immediate detection. Erica's situation existed entirely within those gaps. Medical oversight was also limited. There were no routine appointments or mandatory health evaluations that might have raised concern. Without consistent contact with healthcare providers, there was no external confirmation of her well-being. The absence of medical records did not trigger alerts because there was no requirement for regular reporting. Social visibility declined as well. Erica did not appear in community activities, youth programs, or other settings where adults outside the home might notice changes. Neighbors later stated that they had not seen her for a long time, but absence alone does not always prompt intervention. Families relocate, children change routines, and explanations are often assumed without verification. During this period, no one outside the household contacted law enforcement or child protective services to express concern. There were no welfare checks requested. No follow-up occurred because no formal complaint existed. Systems designed to respond to risk depend on notification. Without it, they remain inactive. This prolonged silence was not the result of a single failure. It was the product of overlapping conditions. Removal from school reduced visibility. Limited healthcare contact removed another checkpoint. Social isolation narrowed observation even further. Together, these factors created a situation where time could pass without scrutiny. From an investigative standpoint, this period later became critical. When Erica was eventually reported missing, the absence of records from these years made reconstruction difficult. There were no attendance logs, medical notes, or third-party observations to establish a clear timeline. The lack of documentation was itself a consequence of the earlier silence. What stands out about this time is not dramatic action, but the lack of it. Nothing occurred that demanded response. That absence allowed months and then years to pass without question. By the time attention was finally drawn to Erica's disappearance, the delay itself had become one of the most troubling aspects of the case. This extended period without inquiry explains why the case remained dormant. It shows how a child can disappear from public life while remaining legally invisible. The consequences of that invisibility would only become clear much later, when questions were finally asked and answers were no longer easy to find. The silence surrounding Erica Parsons ended in 2013, nearly 2 years after she was last confirmed to be alive. At that point, a missing person report was finally made. The delay immediately stood out. In most cases involving children, reports are filed within hours or days. Here, years had passed. That fact alone changed how authorities approached the situation. When law enforcement received the report, basic information raised concern. Erica had not been seen for an extended period, yet no earlier attempt had been made to locate her. Investigators noted that there were no school records, no recent medical visits, and no third-party confirmations of her presence during that time. The absence of documentation made the report unusual and required closer examination. Officers began by establishing the most basic timeline. They asked when Erica was last seen and by whom. The answers pointed back to 2011. This immediately signaled that the situation was not a recent disappearance, but a long, unresolved absence. Such delays often complicate investigations as memories fade and physical evidence becomes harder to recover. Initial checks focused on verification. Law enforcement reviewed public records, school enrollment data, and any available documentation that might confirm Erica's whereabouts after 2011. These checks produced little information. There was no record of her transferring schools, no indication of relocation, and no evidence of continued contact with institutions that normally track children. The absence of documentation made the report unusual and required closer examination. Officers began by establishing the most basic timeline. They asked when Erica was last seen and by whom. The answers pointed back to 2011. This immediately signaled that the situation was not a recent disappearance, but a long, unresolved absence. Such delays often complicate investigations as memories fade and physical evidence becomes harder to recover. Initial checks focused on verification. Law enforcement reviewed public records, school enrollment data, and any available documentation that might confirm Erica's whereabouts after 2011. These checks produced little information. There was no record of her transferring schools, no indication of relocation, and no evidence of continued contact with institutions that normally track children. The report itself prompted concern because of what it lacked. There was no clear explanation for the delay. Investigators considered whether Erica might have been living elsewhere, but no credible evidence supported that possibility. The lack of supporting detail heightened suspicion and required immediate follow-up. Authorities conducted preliminary interviews to clarify the circumstances surrounding the report. Inconsistencies and gaps became apparent. While these did not yet confirm a crime, they raised enough concern to escalate the response. Cases involving delayed reports of missing children are treated with caution because time can obscure responsibility. The delay also affected how the case was classified. Rather than treating it as a recent disappearance, investigators recognized that they were dealing with a situation where critical time had already been lost. This shifted priorities. The focus moved quickly from search and recovery toward verification and assessment of risk. As information was reviewed, officers recognized that Erica's absence had gone unnoticed due to isolation and lack of oversight. That understanding did not excuse the delay, but it explained how it could happen. The combination of homeschooling, limited medical contact, and social withdrawal had removed triggers that usually prompt early intervention. The report transformed Erica's status. She was now officially missing. This designation activated systems that had previously been dormant. Law enforcement involvement expanded and coordination with other agencies began. What had once been an invisible absence became a documented case. Public awareness also followed. Media coverage began focusing on the unusual nature of the delay and the unanswered questions surrounding Erica's whereabouts. The attention added urgency, but also scrutiny. Investigators were careful to separate verified facts from assumption as the case developed. The delayed report marked a turning point. It did not provide answers, but it exposed a gap that could no longer be ignored. The passage of time became central to every decision that followed. Each step taken from this point forward would have to account for what had been lost during the years when no one asked where Erica Parsons was. After the missing person report was filed, authorities moved quickly to verify the information provided and assess immediate risk. The long delay meant investigators could not rely on recent sightings or fresh evidence. Instead, they focused on welfare checks, record review, and consistency across statements. This stage centered on establishing whether Erica Parsons had been living elsewhere, remained within the household, or faced harm that had gone unreported. Law enforcement began by visiting the home where Erica had lived. The purpose was not accusation, but confirmation. Officers assessed living conditions, household structure, and basic details about daily routines during the period following 2011. What stood out was the absence of material or documentation that would normally indicate a child's continued presence. There were no personal items suggesting recent use, no school materials, and no record showing outside engagement. Investigators expanded checks to include public databases and agency records. School enrollment data showed no transfer or continuation. Medical systems reflected no routine care. Social service records did not indicate placement elsewhere. Each check returned the same result. There was no trace of Erica's life beyond the household after the last confirmed sighting. As interviews continued, inconsistencies emerged. Timelines lacked clarity, explanations shifted or failed to align with available records. While these discrepancies did not immediately establish a crime, they raised concern. In missing child cases, inconsistency is treated as a signal for closer scrutiny rather than a conclusion. Welfare checks also extended to verifying claims about Erica's supposed location during the years she was absent. Investigators attempted to confirm whether she had lived with relatives or attended programs outside the county. These efforts produced no supporting evidence. Each avenue pursued narrowed the plausible explanations. The absence of credible confirmation led investigators to reassess the nature of the case. What initially required verification began to resemble concealment. The lack of third-party confirmation became significant. In most legitimate scenarios involving relocation or alternative care, there is some trace, a record, a witness, or documentation. None existed here. Attention turned toward patterns rather than events. Officers examined how oversight had been avoided. Homeschooling removed daily observation, limited healthcare contact reduced another checkpoint. Social isolation minimized casual notice. Together, these factors created an environment where a child could disappear without immediate detection. At this stage, investigators did not yet have physical evidence of a crime. What they had was absence, inconsistency, and lack of corroboration. That combination justified escalation. The case required deeper investigation beyond routine missing person procedures. Coordination between agencies increased. Child Protective Services were notified. Investigators shared findings across departments to ensure no overlooked records existed. The goal was to confirm that every reasonable alternative had been examined before drawing further conclusions. Public communication remained cautious. Authorities acknowledged concern while avoiding speculation. They emphasized that the investigation was active and ongoing. This restraint reflected the seriousness of the situation and the responsibility to rely on verified facts. The welfare checks and record reviews served a critical function. They eliminated explanations that might have resolved the case without further action. With each eliminated possibility, the likelihood of criminal involvement increased, even without direct evidence at that moment. This phase marked a shift in posture. Investigators moved from verification to suspicion based on evidence of absence rather than presence. The case no longer fit the profile of a delayed but benign disappearance. It pointed towards something more serious. By the end of this stage, authorities had established a troubling reality. Erica Parsons had not been seen, recorded, or independently confirmed for years. The explanations provided did not withstand scrutiny. The lack of oversight that once allowed silence now demanded accountability. The welfare checks revealed not a single decisive moment, but a pattern. That pattern set the conditions for the next escalation. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing child through public search. It was about determining how and why a child could vanish from oversight entirely, and what actions had made that possible. As investigators worked through welfare checks and record reviews, the absence of credible explanations began to shape the direction of the case. What had started as an effort to locate a missing child was no longer supported by neutral possibilities. Each avenue meant to confirm that Erica Parsons was safe or living elsewhere had been exhausted without success. That process did not rely on assumption. It relied on elimination. Law enforcement assessed the information collected so far as a whole. Erica had not appeared in school systems, healthcare records, or social services after 2011. No relative, guardian, or institution could verify her presence during the years that followed. The explanations provided did not align with objective records. This accumulation of facts required investigators to change how they approached the case. The classification shifted from a missing person inquiry toward a criminal investigation. This change allowed for broader investigative tools, deeper examination of circumstances, and closer scrutiny of those responsible for Erica's care. The focus narrowed toward accountability rather than location. Detectives reviewed the home environment more carefully, examining what daily life would have required if Erica had still been present. They considered food access, sleeping arrangements, schooling materials, and routines. The lack of evidence supporting ongoing care became increasingly significant. The household did not reflect the presence of a child during the period in question. Investigators also revisited statements given earlier and compared them against timelines and records. Differences in accounts became clearer as details were tested against known facts. In criminal investigations, consistency matters. When accounts fail to align with verifiable information, they become indicators rather than explanations. At this stage, law enforcement coordinated closely with prosecutors. The goal was to ensure that each step taken met legal standards and that any escalation was supported by evidence rather than inference. Prosecutors reviewed findings and advised on next steps, understanding that the case involved a vulnerable victim and a significant delay. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate residential area. Investigators began examining locations connected to the household, including properties and areas that could be associated with prior movements. This phase required careful planning, as time had passed and potential evidence could be degraded or concealed. The investigation also considered the role of isolation. Erica's removal from school and limited contact with outside institutions had not been accidental oversights. They were conditions that shaped what investigators now faced. Understanding how oversight had been avoided became part of determining responsibility. Public awareness increased as authorities confirmed that the case was being treated seriously. Officials remained careful in their statements, avoiding speculation while acknowledging concern. The shift toward criminal investigation signaled that the situation involved more than delayed reporting. Throughout this period, investigators documented every finding in detail. The lack of physical evidence did not slow progress. Absence itself became evidence. In cases involving long delays, what is missing can be as telling as what is found. The investigation turning criminal did not hinge on a single discovery. It was the result of cumulative assessment. Each failed verification added weight. Each inconsistency sharpened focus. By the time the shift occurred, it was supported by a clear pattern rather than a sudden conclusion. This change also altered the stakes. Law enforcement was no longer searching for confirmation of safety. They were working to determine what had happened to Erica Parsons and who bore responsibility. The passage of time complicated that task, but it did not make it impossible. Investigators proceeded with caution and persistence. They understood that cases involving delayed reports require patience and precision. Every decision had to withstand scrutiny, both legal and public. The responsibility to proceed correctly outweighed the pressure to move quickly. The transition into a criminal investigation marked a decisive point. It acknowledged that the silence surrounding Erica's disappearance could not be explained through benign circumstances. The case had moved beyond uncertainty. It now demanded answers grounded in evidence, procedure, and law. From this moment forward, the investigation was no longer defined by what could be checked easily. It was defined by what had been concealed, omitted, or avoided. As the investigation intensified, attention moved beyond records and statements toward the physical world. The long gap since Erica Parsons had last been seen meant that traditional searches for a living child were no longer realistic. Investigators focused on locations connected to the household and areas that could plausibly explain the complete absence of public traces. the passage of time shaped every decision. Evidence might be degraded, concealed, or displaced, yet it could still exist. Law enforcement coordinated search efforts with careful planning. Areas linked to the adoptive parents were reviewed, including places they had access to or could reach without drawing attention. Investigators relied on documented movements, known properties, and geographic connections established through earlier inquiry. Each location was assessed for relevance based on proximity, access, and opportunity. Search activity required patience and precision. The goal was not speed, but accuracy. Officers and specialists worked methodically, understanding that recovery would need to meet forensic standards. The delay in reporting meant that discovery, if it occurred, would carry significant evidentiary weight. In August 2016, remains were located in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. The location was not random. It aligned with investigative findings that had narrowed focus beyond the original residence. The recovery marked the first physical confirmation of what had previously been inferred through absence and inconsistency. Authorities secured the area immediately. Standard procedures were followed to preserve the site and protect potential evidence. The recovery process involved careful documentation and controlled handling. Investigators understood that identification would require scientific confirmation rather than assumption. Forensic examination was conducted to determine identity. This process relied on established methods and comparison with available records. The remains were later confirmed to be those of Erica Parsons. The confirmation provided clarity where uncertainty had persisted for years. It established that she had died and that her death had occurred long before the missing person report. The discovery altered the investigation in a definitive way. What had been a suspected homicide became a confirmed one. The focus shifted entirely toward determining responsibility, timeline, and circumstances surrounding Erica's death. The recovery provided a physical anchor for the case, allowing investigators to move from inference to evidence. Authorities communicated the confirmation carefully. Public statements acknowledged the recovery and identification without releasing unnecessary detail. The emphasis remained on factual confirmation and ongoing investigation rather than narrative framing. The location of the remains contributed to understanding how the case unfolded. It demonstrated that Erica's disappearance had involved deliberate action to conceal her fate. The distance from her home, combined with the length of time before discovery, reflected planning rather than accident. These factors were considered within the broader context of the investigation. Forensic analysis focused on establishing cause and manner of death to the extent possible given the condition of the remains. Investigators were mindful of limitations imposed by time and environment. Even so, confirmation of death and identification were sufficient to support criminal proceedings. The recovery also underscored the impact of delayed reporting. Had Erica's disappearance been addressed earlier, discovery might have occurred sooner. Instead, years had passed. That delay complicated recovery and limited the scope of forensic findings. This reality did not change responsibility, but it shaped the evidentiary landscape. Community response followed the announcement. The confirmation brought a somber clarity to a case that had already raised concern. Public reaction was marked by acknowledgement rather than surprise. By this point, many had understood that the outcome would not involve recovery of a living child. Investigators continued working to integrate forensic findings with existing evidence. Timelines were refined, movements were re-examined. The physical confirmation allowed prosecutors and detectives to align their efforts around a defined sequence of events. The discovery of Erica Parsons' remains represented a pivotal moment. It transformed suspicion into certainty and speculation into fact. It also marked the end of one form of uncertainty and the beginning of a more focused pursuit of accountability. From an investigative standpoint, recovery provided direction. It validated earlier assessments and justified the escalation that had occurred. It also reinforced the importance of methodical persistence in cases where time has obscured clarity. The weight of the discovery lay not in its drama, but in its finality. Erica had been found. Her absence was no longer unexplained. The responsibility now rested with the justice system to address what had happened based on evidence, law, and due process. With the recovery and identification of Erica Parsons' remains, the investigation moved decisively toward legal accountability. The confirmation of her death removed any remaining uncertainty about the nature of the case. Law enforcement and prosecutors now had a factual foundation that allowed formal charges to be pursued based on evidence rather than inference. Authorities focused on the adoptive parents, Sandy and Casey Parsons, who had been responsible for Erica's care during the period when she disappeared. Investigators reviewed the totality of information gathered over several years, including statements, timelines, forensic findings, and documented inconsistencies. Each element was evaluated for reliability and relevance within a criminal framework. The evidence supported the conclusion that Erica had died years earlier, and that her death had not been reported. Prosecutors examined how responsibility should be assigned under state law, considering both actions and omissions. The prolonged concealment of Erica's absence and death became central to the legal case. Charges were filed against both adoptive parents. Sandy Parsons was charged with first-degree murder, while Casey Parsons faced a charge of second-degree murder. The distinction reflected differences in how the law assessed intent and participation based on available evidence. These determinations followed legal standards rather than public perception. As the case moved into the court system, plea negotiations began. Sandy Parsons ultimately entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The plea eliminated the need for a trial and established legal responsibility for Erica's death. Casey Parsons also pled guilty, acknowledging his role under the second-degree murder charge. The pleas were significant. They confirmed the findings of the investigation without requiring testimony or extended courtroom proceedings. The admissions established accountability and allowed the case to move directly toward sentencing. The justice system prioritized resolution grounded in evidence and legal clarity. Sentencing reflected the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. Sandy Parsons received a life in prison without the possibility of parole. Casey Parsons was sentenced to a lengthy prison term consistent with his conviction. These outcomes ensured that both individuals would remain incarcerated for substantial periods, removing any further risk to the public. Public response to the charges and pleas was marked by grim acknowledgement rather than surprise. By this stage, the investigation had made clear that Erica's death involved deliberate concealment over an extended period. The legal outcomes aligned with the seriousness of those findings. Authorities communicated developments carefully. Statements focused on the facts of the pleas and sentences rather than emotional commentary. The emphasis remained on accountability through lawful process. This restraint reflected the responsibility of the justice system to present outcomes without spectacle. The charging phase also clarified the investigative record. Admissions in court aligned with evidence collected over years of inquiry. The long delay between Erica's death and legal resolution underscored the impact of earlier silence, but it did not diminish responsibility. For investigators, the conclusion of the charging process marked the culmination of sustained effort. The case had progressed from absence and uncertainty to forensic confirmation and legal accountability. Each step had required patience, documentation, and adherence to procedure. The pleas removed ambiguity. There would be no competing narratives presented at trial. The facts established through investigation were accepted in court. This outcome allowed the focus to shift from proving guilt to acknowledging consequences. The legal resolution did not offer restoration, it offered accountability. Erica Parsons' life could not be returned, and the years without oversight could not be undone. What the charges and sentences achieved was clarity under law. The case now stood as a matter of record. Responsibility had been assigned through due process. The adoptive parents who had been entrusted with Erica's care were held accountable for her death and its concealment. The justice system addressed the crime within its authority, grounded in evidence and procedure, closing the legal chapter while leaving broader questions for reflection beyond the courtroom. The case entered the judicial phase with facts established through investigation and forensic confirmation. Court proceedings focused on responsibility under law rather than reconstruction of events for a jury. The admissions made by the adoptive parents defined the path forward and shaped how the courts addressed punishment. Prosecutors presented the record assembled over years of inquiry. The timeline showed Erica Parsons had died long before she was reported missing. Documentation demonstrated how her absence had been concealed and how oversight had been avoided. The court reviewed evidence that included investigative findings, expert assessments, and the circumstances surrounding recovery and identification of remains. The emphasis remained on verified information rather than narrative framing. With guilty pleas entered, the process moved directly to sentencing. The court examined statutory requirements and aggravating factors recognized under law. Erica's age, her dependency, and the duration of concealment were central considerations. The law treats the killing of a child and the prolonged failure to report death with particular severity, reflecting the heightened duty of care owed by guardians. Sandy Parsons received a life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of the offense and the determination that permanent incarceration was appropriate. The court's decision followed statutory guidance and the facts admitted through the plea. There was no prospect of early release and no discretionary reduction applied. Casey Parsons received a separate sentence consistent with a second-degree murder conviction. The court considered his role as established by the record and the plea. The sentence imposed ensured long-term incarceration, aligned with the degree of culpability recognized under law. The outcome reflected differentiation within the legal framework rather than equal punishment without distinction. Throughout the proceedings, the court maintained a restrained approach. Statements and filings emphasized legal standards, evidentiary support, and procedural fairness. The absence of a trial meant there was no adversarial testing before a jury, but the admissions provided certainty. The justice system prioritized finality grounded in law. The sentencing phase also addressed the impact of delay. While the passage of time complicated investigation, it did not diminish accountability. The court recognized that concealment extended harm and obstructed oversight. The delay was treated as a factor that increased seriousness rather than mitigating it. Public access to the proceedings was managed carefully. Court records and summaries provided transparency without unnecessary detail. Officials avoided sensational language. The objective was to communicate outcomes accurately while respecting the gravity of the matter. For investigators and prosecutors, sentencing marked the conclusion of their formal role. Years of documentation, verification, and coordination had culminated in legally binding judgments. The process demonstrated how cases with long delays can still reach resolution when evidence is assembled methodically. The court outcomes also clarified responsibility in a way that administrative findings cannot. Criminal sentences carry consequences that define accountability. They signal the state's determination that the conduct met the highest thresholds of culpability under law. The proceedings underscored the difference between explanation and excuse. The court evaluated actions and omissions against statutory standards, not personal narratives. Responsibility was assigned based on evidence and admissions rather than speculation. With sentencing complete, the legal questions were resolved. There would be no appeals that altered the court findings and no further adjudication on guilt. The record was settled. The conclusion of the court phase did not bring restoration. It brought certainty. The justice system addressed the crimes through established procedures and imposed penalties proportionate to the findings. The outcome affirmed that even when oversight fails for years, accountability can still be established through careful investigation and lawful process. The case now stood within the public record as a resolved prosecution. The courts had completed their role, leaving broader reflection to institutions and communities affected by what the proceedings revealed. As the legal outcomes became known, attention shifted outward to the community that had lived alongside the events for years without knowing what had occurred. The confirmation of Erica Parsons' death and the sentences imposed brought a measured but profound response. The reaction was not defined by shock alone. It was shaped by recognition, reflection, and the weight of missed visibility. Public gatherings followed, including vigils held in Erica's memory. These events were quiet and restrained. They focused on acknowledgement rather than display. Community members came together to recognize a child whose life had largely remained unseen beyond her household. The gatherings reflected a shared need to mark her existence and to confront the reality that she had lived and died within their broader environment. Media coverage during this period emphasized facts rather than speculation. Reports revisited the timeline, the delay in reporting, and the institutional gaps that had allowed years to pass without intervention. The focus remained on how such an absence could occur rather than on sensational detail. This approach reinforced a broader conversation about responsibility that extended beyond individual guilt. Residents began reassessing assumptions about familiarity and safety. The case challenged the belief that proximity ensures awareness. Neighbors had lived near Erica without understanding her situation. This realization prompted discussions about attentiveness and the limits of assumption in everyday life. The idea that concern requires certainty was questioned. Local officials and community leaders addressed the public with care. Statements acknowledged the pain associated with the case while emphasizing the importance of lawful resolution. The message centered on awareness and vigilance rather than blame. Officials recognized that community safety depends on both systems and individual attentiveness. The response also included scrutiny of institutional processes. Public discussion turned toward homeschooling oversight, reporting requirements, and the role of external observation in child welfare. These conversations were grounded in the facts of the case rather than abstract debate. The goal was understanding, not reaction. Schools, advocacy groups, and child welfare organizations referenced the case in educational contexts. The emphasis was on recognizing signs of isolation and understanding when to raise concerns. While no single action could have changed the outcome, awareness was viewed as a necessary step toward prevention. The community response remained restrained. There were no calls for extrajudicial action or public retaliation. Attention stayed focused on the established legal outcome and on learning from what had been revealed. This restraint reflected recognition that accountability had been addressed through the justice system. Over time, the case became a reference point rather than a daily headline. Its impact persisted in quieter ways. It influenced conversations about oversight, reporting, and the responsibilities shared among neighbors, institutions, and caregivers. The memory of Erica Parsons became associated with the importance of noticing absence as much as presence. What defined the public response was not uniform emotion, but collective consideration. The case prompted reflection on how easily a child can become invisible when layers of oversight are removed. That understanding did not assign blame to a community, it acknowledged vulnerability within ordinary structures. The reckoning did not resolve loss, it reframed attention. The community response recognized that justice had addressed responsibility, but that prevention depends on awareness and engagement. Erica's name became tied to that understanding, not through spectacle, but through a renewed focus on the importance of visibility in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. As the legal case concluded, attention turned toward the broader structures that had surrounded Erica Parsons' life and disappearance. The investigation had established responsibility for her death, but it also revealed how easily a child could vanish from oversight without immediate consequence. The focus shifted from individual actions to the systems that failed to detect absence over an extended period. One of the most significant gaps involved educational oversight. Erica had been removed from public school and identified as being homeschooled. In North Carolina, homeschooling operates under a system that relies heavily on parental reporting and limited external verification. While many families comply responsibly, the framework assumes good faith. When that assumption is abused, detection mechanisms are weak. There were no routine in-person checks that could confirm Erica's well-being or even her continued presence. The absence of school attendance records eliminated one of the most reliable indicators used to identify risk. Teachers and administrators often notice changes in behavior, physical condition, or attendance that trigger concern. Without that daily contact, warning signs remained unseen. Erica's removal from school reduced visibility in a way that proved decisive. Healthcare oversight represented another gap. There were no routine medical visits documented during the period when Erica was absent. Pediatric care often provides an additional layer of observation, particularly for vulnerable children. Without regular contact with healthcare providers, there was no opportunity for external professionals to assess her condition or raise concerns. Child protective services were also limited by the absence of reports. These agencies typically respond to complaints or referrals. Without notification, they remain inactive. In this case, there were no early referrals that could have prompted welfare checks. The system did not fail to act, it was never activated. The case highlighted how systems operate independently rather than collectively. Education, healthcare, and social services function within their own boundaries. When a child is removed from multiple systems at once, there is no automatic mechanism to flag disappearance. Erica's situation exposed how isolation across domains can create invisibility. Homeschooling regulation became a central point of discussion. Advocates noted that oversight varies widely by state and often prioritizes parental autonomy over verification. Critics argued that minimal checks can allow neglect or abuse to go undetected. The case provided concrete evidence of how such gaps can be exploited over time. The delay in reporting also raised questions about mandatory reporting standards. While educators and healthcare workers are required to report concerns, neighbors and extended community members are not held to the same obligations. Absence alone does not constitute a reportable offense. This reality complicates intervention when isolation is intentional but not outwardly visible. Investigators later noted that earlier reporting could have altered outcomes. Even a welfare check might have disrupted concealment or triggered oversight. However, retrospective analysis does not change the legal framework in place at the time. Systems respond to information. Without it, they remain dormant. The case also revealed challenges in interagency communication. Records existed within separate systems, but there was no centralized mechanism to reconcile absence across education, healthcare, and social services. Each system saw only its own data. None had reason to suspect a problem in isolation. Policy discussions following the case emphasized the need for balance. Oversight must protect children without unduly restricting parental rights. The challenge lies in designing safeguards that verify well-being without assuming misconduct. Erica's case demonstrated the cost of insufficient verification when trust is misplaced. Advocacy groups referenced the case in calls for reform. Proposals included periodic wellness confirmations for homeschooled children and improved data sharing between agencies. These discussions did not accuse homeschooling families broadly. They focused on structural vulnerabilities exposed by documented events. The case also underscored how accountability mechanisms activate only after harm is discovered. Criminal law addresses wrongdoing after the fact. Preventive systems must operate earlier. When those systems lack reach, intervention becomes reactive rather than protective. Importantly, the failures identified were not singular errors. They were cumulative. No single agency ignored a clear warning. Instead, multiple systems operated as designed, yet collectively failed to detect prolonged absence. That distinction matters. It shifts discussion from blame toward reform. The investigation provided clarity on what did not happen. There were no routine checks, no automatic alerts, and no cross-system reconciliation. These absences allowed years to pass without scrutiny. Understanding that sequence is essential for preventing repetition. The case also raised ethical questions about responsibility beyond law. While legal accountability was established for the crime, institutional responsibility remains more complex. Systems are shaped by policy choices. Revising those choices requires political will and public understanding. Erica Parsons' case became a reference point for examining how society monitors the welfare of children outside traditional structures. It highlighted that visibility is not guaranteed and that protection depends on intentional design. The lesson is not that oversight should be intrusive, it is that absence should not be invisible. When children disappear from public life, systems should notice. The failure to notice in this case was not inevitable, it was structural. Addressing those structures does not undo harm, but it can reduce future risk. The case demonstrated that accountability must extend beyond courtrooms into policy. Without that extension, legal resolution remains incomplete. The examination of systemic gaps does not reopen the case, it contextualizes it. Erica Parsons' life and death exposed vulnerabilities that exist wherever oversight depends entirely on trust without verification. Recognizing those vulnerabilities is the first step towards addressing them. With the legal process complete and responsibility established, the case of Erica Parsons entered its final stage, not in court, but in public record and institutional memory. The justice system addressed the crime through investigation, prosecution, and sentencing. What remained was the broader meaning of what had occurred and how it should be understood going forward. Accountability in this case was clear under law. Those responsible for Erica's death and concealment were identified, charged, and sentenced according to evidence and legal standards. The outcome did not rely on speculation or narrative framing. It relied on documented facts, forensic confirmation, and admissions made in court. The justice system functioned as designed once activated. What complicates reflection is the length of time before that activation occurred. Erica was absent from public life for years before questions were raised. That delay shaped every aspect of the case, from investigation to evidence recovery. It also shaped how the outcome is understood. Accountability was achieved, but only after irreversible loss. The case demonstrates that criminal responsibility and systemic responsibility are distinct. Courts address individual actions, systems address prevention. Both matter. One delivers consequence, the other determines whether harm is detected early enough to intervene. In this instance, intervention came too late. The lessons that emerge are not abstract, they are grounded in documented gaps. Oversight depended on visibility. Visibility depended on participation in public systems. When that participation ended, safeguards weakened. No single decision caused failure, a sequence of withdrawals did. The case underscores the importance of noticing absence. Protection often focuses on identifying harm through visible signs. This case shows that disappearance itself can be a warning. When a child ceases to appear in education, healthcare, and community spaces, the absence deserves attention, even without overt indicators. It also highlights the limits of assumption. Familiarity can reduce scrutiny. Trust can replace verification. In this case, trust went unchallenged for years. The cost of that trust became evident only after discovery. Public awareness following the case reflected this understanding. Discussion shifted toward how communities and institutions might respond differently when a child becomes unseen. The focus was not on fear, but on attentiveness. The goal was not suspicion, but awareness. The legacy of the case does not lie in punishment alone. It lies in recognition. Recognition that systems designed to protect children must account for those who are removed from view. Recognition that accountability after harm is not equivalent to prevention before harm. Erica Parsons is now part of public record, not as a statistic, but as a case that revealed how silence can persist within ordinary structures. Her life did not intersect with oversight in ways that triggered protection. That fact matters as much as the crime itself. The justice system resolved what it could. Courts imposed sentences, investigators closed files, but the responsibility to learn extends beyond those institutions. It rests with policymakers, professionals, and communities that shape how children are seen. This case does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. Clarity about what happens when visibility is lost. Clarity about the importance of questioning absence. Clarity about the difference between legal resolution and societal responsibility. The final lesson is restrained but firm. Accountability matters, process matters, awareness matters. When any of those fail, the consequences are not theoretical, they are lived. The record of this case stands as a reminder that protection begins with noticing and that silence should never be mistaken for safety.